this message requires application, not just me telling you something. It does require some application, perhaps on the heels of last week, when I talked about God basically taking his spirit from Saul because he was of no more use to God in the state that he was in. Now, I believe that God will keep trying. He keeps trying with, I'll go back to my building blocks, he keeps trying with America, gives us many chances, but we're blind, we can't see the opportunities. It may be on we'll call it on our community level, this community, this church, this people, but we don't see the opportunity. And it may be on an individual level. Stuff is happening to you in your life like a tempest, and you can't see the opportunity for blessing in it because it doesn't look like it. All it looks like is maybe you're being unjustly accused, or maybe your life is in shambles. Whatever's going on, it just does not look like an opportunity. And then somehow in the middle of, let's just say, your life's events, not just this last week or this last year, but your entire life, if you look back, surely you've had enough situations where you were like Paul, where it looks like all hope is lost. Surely that's most of us. We've had at least one experience in our lifetime where we said, I have no hope. You ever said that? I have no hope. I have no hope. When hope, in his case, that they should be saved, delivered, but in our case, I have no hope. But if we get our wits about us, kind of interesting, if we grab hold of the thing that we knew before, God promised me, he promised you, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Get your wits about you, and you recognize God is in the midst, then you can start looking at what looks like a certain calamity, and you can begin asking the question, Lord, what exactly is in this for me to see and learn? Teach me. Make this something that I can learn from. I don't want to be like the one, and I'm now referring to an individual that used to be on staff many years ago who used to say, well, I don't want to make that mistake again. That one, that particular one. But that's not the attitude that God's looking for. He knows we're going to make mistakes all the time. It's the attitude being corrected. What did David cry out? Create in me a clean heart. The attitude when things have happened or are happening that give us an opportunity. God gives us the opportunity to be blessed in our brokenness. Now, you may not think so, but I know in my lifetime when I've had the things that I'm describing where I think all hope is lost, and I stop and I get my wits about me, I realize one thing. God's promises to me, which he has not changed, the promises I hang on to, which have not changed, and when I stop the carousel of my mind long enough, I realize God's going to work this out somehow. That's called regaining sanity, right? Then you realize you still have a crisis, there's still a tempest, there's still a storm, there's still issues, there's still whatever it is, but suddenly you just take a deep breath and you say, God's going to enter in and work it out because he's in control. Now, think about what I just said to you, because in the process of doing that, I have over my lifetime, I've wrestled with God that way. I have wrestled it out just when I think I've got everything that I need to know about my walk worked out, a new disaster comes my way, and a new cycle of wrestling with God. And then I kind of, as I say, get my sanity and realize there's got to be a purpose for this. Now, I'm not the paragon or the prototype of the how-to here, so don't think that I'm giving you this is the way you do things. But I do want to paint a picture now that I've given you all that background. That's kind of the meat and potatoes of what I want to touch on. And I'm going to take you into the Bible in a minute, but I want to paint a picture for you. It's important that I paint this picture because without this picture, I will probably lose about 50% of you. I want you to think of a time in your life. I'll give you mine so you can find something that is analogous to it. For me, it was the day I buried Dr. Scott. We left the mausoleum, and suddenly all the noise and all the people and it just became quiet. And suddenly, for the first time, I was alone. Not alone, lonely. I was alone with God. That had never happened before like that. All the noise is now, even though there were a few people with me that traveled back to Southern California, all of the noise was settling like dust. And there was a moment where I realized I am alone with God. Can you think of a time in your life where you've had that? Because that will help set the tone for what I'm going to do today. I want you to think of that real carefully. If something comes to your mind where suddenly just everything's just shut down and you find yourself alone, feeling not lonely, alone, and with God. Now let me paint the biblical picture of someone that you know all too well. And then that's why I said I want to paint the picture first, because it'll give you an idea of all that I want to say. Imagine your whole life is one of wrestling with man and wrestling with God. Your whole life is that. It consists only of that. Oh, in between there are pockets of normality, perhaps, whatever that means. But your whole life is a wrestling match. Now, I relate to this because it took me a long time to accept God does everything perfectly. It's we imperfect human beings that can't wrap our mind around the perfection of His plan, which in our hands will always be foiled. And here, a person, an individual in the Bible, who truly, if you think about it, has been caricatured and characterized a certain way, but we are indeed exactly like He is. An individual who God said from the beginning, you probably know who I'm talking about. God said from the beginning that He loved him. I'm talking about Jacob. God said from the beginning that He loved him, not his brother. As cruel as that may sound to some, God loved Jacob and not Esau. And as cruel as it may sound for some, if you look at Jacob's life, you've got a whole, I would call it a mystery. And the mystery is, he passed so many of these places in the Bible that we're going to encounter briefly. But specifically one place that he passes, that 20 years earlier he passed, without the providence and the provision of God, now returning to that place as a prosperous man, but there's still something wrong with him. And I will tell you, until we are broken of certain things, nothing can change. And what I've found is many times we think we're broken, but we're not. It's just an experience we've survived. It doesn't alter our frame of reference. It doesn't change anything at all. That's what is concerning to me. If God has the capacity to get you or get me alone, so we're alone with God, not alone by ourselves, not alone deserted. We have the recognition God is with us. And God can get us to be, I am alone with God. And I can acknowledge that God is around me and in the midst. I may not say that He's doing anything right now, but He's around me. He's here. He's present. That is the beginning of God being able to enter in and begin to work a work of correction. And if it takes breaking, there are many men in the Bible who were alone with God. 5 of them I counted. I'm sure there's more. where the scripture plainly says these men were alone. Jeremiah is one of them. Moses is another, up in the mount, alone with God. Daniel, in the lion's den, no less, but alone with God. Paul, Jacob. I don't know why we fear this thing so much about being alone. If God is really real to us, we're not alone. And remember, this same individual had the experience of the ladder and the angels going up and down, and at Bethel, where he experienced what in the New Testament we would call salvation, he experienced essential contact with God by the angels coming up and down in the dream that he saw. And he awakes and he says, surely God was in this place, and I didn't know it. God was not ready at that point because Jacob wasn't ready to be broken. You know, maybe he thought it was a hard night sleeping with his head on a rock for a pillow. Maybe that was a tough night. But there'd be tougher nights ahead. And with each thing that we encounter when we find ourselves alone with God, you notice the first thing we'd like to do when we're alone, our nature, that's our human nature, is to find someone to not be, so we're not alone. And I'm not talking about romantically, I'm talking about usually on a social level. For most people, it's difficult to be alone. Somebody once said to me, you do alone real good. Except we're talking about the fact that I'm not alone, I'm with God. Alone with God. And that's when God has, we'll call it, it is the perfect moment to begin a work. Now, in Jacob's life, if Padan Aram was the place where God dealt with, essentially with Jacob's past, his past being at this point Laban and Laban's family and his servants, all basically disappearing over the hill and into the darkness as they've settled the matter between them. What lies ahead is that ford Jabbok, which some Hebrew scholars translate as pouring out or being emptied. And if you think about it, it could only be, I really want you to make an application from what I said last week. Otherwise, these two messages, well, they could stand on their own, I'm sure, but this is part of recognizing sometimes when God comes to give correction through His Word. Sometimes it comes through His messenger, sometimes it comes to you as you're sitting there and reading, and smack dab hits you just right there between the eyes as you're reading. But something that breaks inside the individual, that you finally have come to the point you're changed. Doesn't mean that that is something imprintable upon the soul. In other words, like I've said, in my younger days, I had bouts of being very rich and very poor, and I went through both extremes. And in the days when I was rich, I was extremely wasteful. In the days when I was poor, to have a roll of toilet paper was a luxury. You know what? I never forgot the days of being poor. In fact, that's what I'm talking about. There's certain things that break within inside the individual that you just never forget. They change how you view things. They change how you see individuals or the stewardship you practice. They change everything. Now, whether you're broken in the process, truly broken in the process, can become a blessing. One of Morgan's sermon's titles is "The Crippling That Crowns." I happen to agree. If that is what comes when God actually comes to take corrective work inside the individual, then it will be a blessing. But I'm going to tell you one thing God will not work with, and that's people who have attitudes that although they're down and they have been slightly humbled, they're not broken. And God can't fix something in partiality like that. God can do whatever He wants, but if it's really going to be fixed for real, Like I say to you, I don't like Band-Aids. I don't think God does either. And the stuff that people parade as humility or a contrite spirit, I think sometimes those things are just in the moment. You're going to know, and I'm going to know, when I say God is the one who reaches down and corrects, when something's truly happened. There's something inside that breaks, that you're never the same. And it's not something you say, oh, gee, well, that's a terrible thing. No, you're never the same. In God's eyes, you will see things differently. Will the old man and the old nature still be there? Yes. But in Jacob's case, being alone with God allowed certain events to take place. If you want to open your Bibles to the 32nd chapter of Genesis, and while you do that, I'll paint the picture. Imagine a great caravan of people. These are Jacob's wives and their handmaids and all the children. Imagine a great caravan that I just described of Laban and his family and servants and all of the things that are moving around in Jacob's universe. Just even the imagery of how much livestock is with Jacob. The noise, the hoof sounds, and then I want you to think about sitting back for a second and being Jacob and watching the dust settle as everything starts to get more quiet. As I said, Laban has disappeared into the darkness and is not to reappear again for us on the pages of our book. But there's this quiet now that's starting to sink down. And this is what is interesting. Genesis 32, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. For a guy who's had a lifetime of conniving and deceiving and cheating, God obviously still wanted Jacob because God had a plan for Jacob. God has a plan for you. God has a plan for me. Now, I'm not saying that Jacob here did anything great. It says earlier in the chapter, the end of the chapter before, that he offered a sacrifice upon the mount, but that's it. The thing that did happen, though, I can say this, is God had told him to go to a certain place and return, and he did obediently this time do that. And it says, when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's host, and he called the name of that place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother unto the land of Seir, the country of Edom. Now, all of this is still Jacob conniving a little bit, preparing, trying to test the waters. Even though God's showing him angels, and he still sees with spiritual eyesight, he's still capable of seeing spiritual things, he is still Jacob. That's where most of us are until God basically takes what he wants to take out of you. And whether he does it in one installment or multiples, that's his prerogative. But Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, commanded them, saying, thus shall you speak to my lord Esau, thy servant Jacob, thus saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now. I have oxen, asses, flocks, men servant, women servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I might find grace in thy sight. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him. And Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Now, I'm not sure if this will make a connection to anybody, but God is not the author of fear. And the only thing that we really have to latch on to in a prototype, if you will, as I'm looking at Jacob real carefully to make an application for us today, the only thing we have to latch onto here is he's still negotiating. He's still scheming, he's still planning, he's still conniving. which is where most of us spend most of our spiritual life. Whether you may not like what I'm saying, but the design is not for you to like it. The design is to open up some eyes today that sometimes the need for God to really, Dr. Scott preached a message one time talking about God whacking people. Leave it to Dr. Scott to come up with terms like that. The point is, God knows what we need. I'm saying this corporately. I'm not saying this as I'm pointing fingers at you. When I say we, He knows what I need. He knows what you need. And He can always, this is the wonderful thing, He can always make things happen if we'll see the opportunities and use them as blessings. Here is an opportunity coming, but instead of reacting by faith, remember, He saw angels. He said He called the place, this is God's host, called the name of the place Mayanaim. He could have stood there right there and began to petition. He will in a minute, but He could have stood there and petitioned at that very moment instead of being full of fear and distress. He could have started praying. He does in the next 2 verses. He divided people that was with Him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 bands, and said, if Esau come to the one company and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. I'll still have, if he takes all of that, I'll still have this over there. You ever done that with God? Don't answer. We all have. Well, I'll just make sure I'll cover my butt over here, because if this happens over there, then I'm covered over there, but I'll take care of this, and I'm still negotiating and playing this shell game. Here comes the prayer. In verse 9. This prayer, this part of the prayer that he begins to pray, has essentially the purpose of God in it. O God of my father Abraham and of my father Isaac, the Lord which saidest unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. You notice he says, Father Abraham, Isaac, the passing on of the promise of God to be the people that he, God, promised them to be. Here is the purpose there, and I will deal well with thee. And he goes on in this prayer in verse 10, I am not worthy of the least of thy mercies, and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now become 2 bands. Providence, or provision, if you will, because I said 20 years earlier he passed through this place with nothing. Now he's got these 2 bands. He's got wives and handmaids and servants and animals and lots and lots and lots of animals. Doesn't matter where they came from. Now, listen, God prospered him and the work of his hands at Uncle Laban's house. Doesn't matter what he took with him, God still prospered him there. So a sign of something, can you stand today like Jacob and say, maybe you don't have this, I was here 20 years ago and I passed through here 20 years ago and I had nothing, and today I have lots. Maybe it's 20 years ago I was spiritually bankrupt. Today I'm spiritually rich. I've been taking in the lessons of God. I've been taking in the correction of God as part of our prayer when these things happen to us. Here's now prayer of protection. He says, deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me, and the mother with the children. Thou saidest, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Here's another part of that promise of God in his purposes given unto Jacob in that first blessing. So with all of that in mind, verses 13, at least through 21, are still Jacob still conniving, conciliatory concept of how I'm going to make this work, by how many animals and livestock I'm going to send off, just in case, as kind of a somewhat goodwill offering. And if you think about it, if you were to count up how many animals, and I once did, I've got it written here in my Bible, of how much he sent off, it tells you that if he's sending off 200 she-goats, 20 he-goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, and that's just like, ding, a drop in the bucket. That means that he had plenty. And at that point, all of his plenty didn't matter. If he had the mindset that his brother's coming to get him, it didn't matter how much. He's like, picture of Esau, a little bit like the Grim Reaper. He's going to come knocking at your door, no matter what you have, right? What if the help you expected did not come? When all hope was lost, instead of saying, fear not, I won't be afraid, what time I'm afraid, I will trust, instead of that, not even recognizing I'm alone with God, because he's about to be alone with God. Kind of interesting. You find yourself in one of these situations, instead of trying to figure out how the flesh can get you out of it, you stop in your tracks and you think about the fact that God is with you, and you go back to lean on the promises of God and God's word. But given that Jacob didn't have the written word, he could have said, I'm going to look in the book of Genesis and see. Never mind. Verse 13, he lodged there that same night, took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother, 200 she-goats, 20 he-goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milk camels and their colts, 40 kine, 10 bulls, 20 she-asses, 10 foals. And he delivered them into the hand of his servants. And then it says, he says unto his servants, pass over before me, put a space betwixt drove and drove. Space them out. Just kind of, make it look really stretched out. This will really give a real big appearance here. Stretch them out. Commanded the foremost, saying, when Esau my brother meeteth thee and asketh thee, saying, whose art thou? And whither goest thou? And whose are these before thee? Then thou shalt say, they be thy servant Jacob's. It's a present sent to my lord Esau. And behold, also he is behind us. Now, this is very conniving, because he even plans out the speech of what Esau is going to say. Where are you going? Where are you coming from? Whose are those? Who do those belong to? Probably something no one has really considered is that Jacob really was a know-it-all of the most despicable kind, because he's already anticipating what the brother's going to say and what his reaction's going to be. Now, okay, if you haven't figured this out by now, and forgive me, I don't mean to sound condescending, but if you haven't figured this out by now, this is to so many that last week some took the correction and some did not. And unfortunately, this is what I think. If you're not willing to look at yourself, just as I must do as your pastor, find myself in these pages and recognize this is God's way. And if it was all pleasant and all easy all the time, I don't know what to tell you, but the book doesn't show me that, and the life of the people that have lived through the ages doesn't show me that. It tells me that God is constantly clipping and pruning, like John 15 talks about. If you abide in me and I abide in you, but he's constantly clipping and pruning, and I've never heard of something being clipped or pruned. If you think about the activity of that, if it was clipping or pruning to the flesh, that's going to hurt. I'm sure it doesn't hurt the tree. But you understand pictorially what I'm trying to say. It doesn't sound like a spiritual massage, like God's out there working on the Kobe beef cow and massaging it and giving it beer. Chip, chip, clop, 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 chop, chop, right? That's the way it goes. I commanded the second, third, and all that followed the drove, saying, on this manner shall ye speak unto Esau when you find him. And say ye moreover, behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goeth before me, and afterward, and I will see his face, peradventure he will accept of me. So went the present over before him, and himself lodged that night in the company. And he rose up that night, took his 2 wives, his 2 women servants, and his 11 sons, and passed over the ford Jabbok. He took them, sent them over the brook, and sent over that he had. And Jacob was left alone. I circled that word because I have my own ABCs to this message. I circled that word. Jacob was left alone. Now, all of this was Jacob's, his design in his mind, his conniving, his how am I going to do this? But God entered in even to that because he needed to be there alone. And he was alone. And there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. Or your margin might read the ascending of the morning. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And here, in this one moment, being alone with God, he is broken. Now, don't you think it's interesting? His name, heel catcher, but his whole life has been a wrestling match with his brother, a wrestling match with his father, a wrestling match with Laban, now wrestling with God. The whole life is embodied in this one moment. It's almost as though God said, I've had enough. I want to use you, and there's no other way to use you but this. I've had enough. Now, if it was us, we might be in the process of wrestling. As I said, this is what happens when we encounter problems and the tumult of life and things that happen. So often we don't consider that it is in these instances that we might actually, where we think all hope is lost, where we think we're in a valley we can't come out of, it's really right there that actually the opportunity for God to bless us is there. If you go looking for it on the mountaintop, you're not going to find it, but right here. Most of us, maybe we would have reacted by saying, what'd you do to me? You hurt me. You crippled me. You ruined me. That's what you did, right? And he said, let me go for the daybreak. If that's the angel of the Lord or the Lord, if you want to call it an angel or a Christophany, let me go for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go except thou bless me. That's Jacob talking, saying, clinging now. If you want some ABCs, here's some ABCs for you. He was alone. He was broken. Now he's reduced to clinging. Let me go for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go except thou bless me. How did he know in that moment, instead of saying, heal me, because he could have done that, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. And this is what needs to be gleaned out of this, because it's such a common thing for us. It's a common message, and we're all so familiar with it. But the reality is, and this is the reality, and I referenced this last week, just as God reached in to use David's debacle with Bathsheba by the mouth of Nathan to confront David, but it's what led that brokenness, that reality of what he had done, led him to pen some of the greatest psalms of repentance. The greatest one in my mind is Psalm 51. So it seems to me that God can bless us along the way as he's breaking us. I remember Dr. Scott had horses in Kentucky. We had gone to Kentucky, and he had called one of the men that worked there to bring one of the horses in and asked if the horse had been broken. They said they just started putting a saddle on the horse, but it wasn't broken to ride. And I remember Dr. Scott saying, well, you keep working on that horse until it's, he said to the gentleman, until it's ready for me. Because until a horse is broken, it may be a thing of beauty, but it's not a thing of use. God does the same thing with us. And until that comes, you can be a thing of beauty in your eyes, maybe even God's eyes, I'm not quite sure. But until breaking comes, just like that horse, of no use. I'll tell you something more. That horse was transported out to Southern California. And the guy who worked on that horse for probably weeks, maybe months, came out with the horse, put the saddle on the horse. Dr. Scott was real smart. He said, "You get on it." And I remember the guy got on, and most of the time they would mount from one side. He got on the one side, and the horse was fine. And Dr. Scott said, "Get off and get on the other side." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "I want to see you get on the other side." The horse would not stand in place if you mounted him on the other side. And I remember Dr. Scott saying, "Take the horse back and keep working until it's broken to be mounted from either side. Otherwise, it's of no use to me." Because he knew that there might be individuals getting on who maybe don't mount from the same side, and therefore it would be a danger. I see God's hand in a lot of this and say to myself, this is the way God works. He wants something that is usable, not something that thinks it can be used, but something that's usable. And when the attitude is right, usually it's because God has been doing some whacking and some working on, the message of the potter's wheel and the potter's house. Same thing. God will keep working as long as the attitude is right. And we all get out. We can all get out of line. There's a point, I think, where we all do in our walk at least once. And thank God that we serve a gracious God who's always going to meet us more than halfway for each one of these things that happens. But back to Jacob for a minute. Because after he is alone with God, and he is broken, and he's reduced to clinging, he gets his name changed. Now, if I was Jacob, I'd like nothing better than have my name changed too, because I wouldn't want to be known as a heel catcher or a cheat or a deceiver, whatever you want the Hebrew name to specifically mean in its ambiguity. I wouldn't want that to be the name that I would carry for the rest of my life. Bad enough now that I'm going to be crippled. Do I have to have that name? Just see if God didn't change his name. Somebody might say, I see how you got that name, heel catcher. Never mind. Changed his name to Israel. Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. It's kind of interesting because Jacob asked him and said, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." And he said, "Wherefore, what is that thou dost ask after my name?" And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. Now, here is what I want to bear down on. That limp never went away. I'm not suggesting that Jacob was perfect or perfected in that moment, but that limp never went away. And this is the difference between when we talk about God entering in and turning something that looks like a broken, bad, tumultuous situation into a blessing. God can enter into that as long as with our eyesight, our attitude, the way we're looking at all of this, we recognize God had a purpose in all of this. But the part that's broken will always remain broken. In other words, the thing that God has done, there may be other things that in a certain individual need to be more work, more, shouldn't say that, then people will think it's Beverly Hills. Never mind. The point is, if we will look at Jacob, we'll recognize something. God had to get him to a place where he was alone, where he could break him, and that breaking, that touch was permanent. I'm not talking about once saved, always saved. I'm talking about the touch of God that crippled him was permanent. When we really desire to make a change in our life, the things that we'll say again and again, if we're at all honest with ourselves, we say, yeah, I know that's part of my nature, and I take this to God in prayer. I don't really like that. I wish He'd change that in me. Well, be careful what you pray for. God might just indulge your prayer, but it may not be in the comfortable fashion, as I said, of massaging Kobe beef. It might be by some whacking and some chopping, pruning. And I think probably if Jacob is a prototype by any means, I want to say, hopefully today, for some of us who are here, listening, trying to make an application, the days, like this conversation, the day breaketh, the dawn, the light, that first light is coming. And it's in that first light, when you've come through the darkest time, that God is going to do that. Usually I'm not going to say God will always bless in daylight. Sometimes, like this, is a blessing, a strange blessing at a strange time. But the important thing is that we take this, and as many times as I have preached on this message, as many times as Dr. Scott has preached on this message, I think a lot of times we just discount this as a Bible character, but we don't really see ourselves there. If we do, it lasts for all but maybe an hour or a day or a week. And I'm guilty of this myself. I don't accuse you of anything that I haven't already done. Then you just move on. And I'm asking you, specifically those who think, the question is, can you triumph over your troubles? And the answer is absolutely. With God, all things are possible. But if it's something done by God, it's probably going to leave a mark. And usually, some of those marks aren't the ones that you'd have preferred. But those are the marks that matter with God. It's like him saying, I was there. That's his autograph. I was there. And the next thing is to really recognize God does have a purpose. Just like God had one for Jacob, I've said this before, God has a purpose for you in your life. You know, the people that pray to know God's will, you start with God's book because that's His last will and testament left to you and to me. But He has a purpose for you, and He has a plan for you. And that these are not just good swelling words, but in the process of that purpose and plan, maybe some of us, the flesh person, gets in the way. So God will break, and He will break. Not because He takes pleasure in it, but because that's sometimes the only way He can use people. And if it means that somehow you have to walk with a limp, let's call it a spiritual limp. Events in your life that have happened that you say, I will never forget that. For some here today, at least I know a few in the sound of my voice, they served in Vietnam. They'll never forget that. The images of the things they saw, Hollywood can't even properly depict. The things that are forged and etched in their minds. Some have served in Iraq and far-flung places. And the things that they've seen, I can't even imagine. Those are life-changing. They're life-changing to the point that it changes everything. Now, I'm not saying that all experiences are on the same plane, but each individual has had those moments in their lifetime where it's life-changing. But it can be life-changing for just a little while, like a car accident where you escaped death and didn't have any bodily harm, but it was serious enough. And in the moment, in that day, and the days afterwards, you're shook up about it, but give you about 6 months driving in Southern California, you'll get over it real quick. Unless you get a new insurance bill. It'll just be a thing that happened. It won't actually change. Do you understand what I'm saying? The difference between things that are life-changing and things that in the moment, but then they just dissipate. And I'm praying for God to do some breaking for all of us. This is not just for some or for a few, for all of us. That we might be usable for Him, more desirable to Him. You know, He loves the unlovable. I've said I never understood why God came to save and touch me, but He did. And there are many people who are just like me, who have the same mindset, just like that. I don't know why, but I'm not complaining. It just is a wonderful thing. But this is how God does it. The very way that Peter talks about gold being purified by fire. How do you purify it? You can't purify it by any other means. Or how do you get, if you're not threshing wheat, how do you get what you want out of that? It has to be worked on. It can't just be left and massaged. Everything has its way, and I said there are spiritual, if you want to call them principles or laws of how God does. I don't think the Apostle Paul set out at the very beginning when we encounter him as a New Testament type. No, he wasn't a heel catcher like Jacob. He was zealous for God, just on the other side, persecuting Christians. And I don't really think that in his mind he was doing anything wrong when he was actually an accessory to murder and holding the coat of Stephen while they stoned him. And yet this activity of his past, I believe, haunted him throughout his whole ministry. Not only as what I've said before is that thorn in his flesh that the devil kept coming at him by just aggravating him with that, but also by the places he went, and they'd say, well, isn't this the one who persecuted? Isn't the one that he did this and he did that? How can we trust him? How do we know? It followed him for his whole life. You want to call that a mark of God? Because it was. And God used those marks as a blessing. So it's all perspective. Now, on the heels of what I talked about last week, there's only one way for God to cut down a proud spirit. There's only one way for the people of God to get back to some degree of proper relating to God, and that is to let God start his work on you. And maybe you have been, like I did for many years, wrestling with God and not even recognizing that you're fighting the very thing that God has sent to try and help you and to fix you. Now, I always say, the devil's a great imitator, and he can come as an angel of light, and people get confused. But I can tell you, anything that God is doing will never contradict his word. So if something's going on that appears to be a wrestling match in your soul about things that you've been wrestling with and you feel like there's no solution to it, it will not contradict God's word if it's of God. Some people say, I'm not sure if this is God or if this is the devil. Well, the devil's the author of confusion. And if you're truly not sure, there's one remedy. Stand still and wait on the Lord. I always tell people, what should I do then? I'm conflicted. Well, then stand still and wait. And you may be standing there for a long time, but stand there and wait patiently on the Lord. Now let me talk to the people here inside the building. And those of you who listen every single week. The last 2 weeks have been, for me at least, we'll talk about the last 7 days. It's a better way of doing this. Have been very profitable spiritually to me. Because even I needed to have time alone with God. Everybody needs that time. To sit, not just the normal prayer time, to run in and tell God my troubles or to run in and say thanks. I needed that alone time to put things in perspective for this church, for myself. And why I say it was profitable for me is because it dawned on me that so many times we, the body, collectively, we come in, we listen, but there is no, oh, that's me. I have a few people that call in and say, that's me, but most of the time, most of the people that need to be identifying with the message are never the ones you hear from. Now, I'm not looking for people to say, I enjoy or I like or you did a good job, because my thought process is I'm going to be obedient to what I see the Lord's leading is for this church, even if it's unpopular or disliked. The main thing is we all are God's children, all of us, me, you, the ones I cannot see, all God's children. And if we're children of God, we'll accept from His Word, not from me as some person who's going to be dictating what goes on, but from His Word, how He handles the problems of life, of living, and of also trying to bring about His purpose. Now, if you don't like what I've said today or what I said last week, then I probably can't help you with anything else in your life, because the two things that I dealt with last week was if the spirit is not right, God can't use you. And if you're willing to pay attention to what I said today, and I said, forgive me, I do not mean to sound condescending, I really want to hit this home. Will the wrestling with God conquer you? Will you be conquered by it, or will you still have the mind to say, I will conquer this, and I will move on from this event unchanged and determined to keep forging on, which is Stoicism, versus, no, God has something in all things for me, because He enters into all things to work His good. There's a lesson here somewhere for me too, for you too, to glean and to say, Lord, I know I'm no gift, and the pain of what needs to be broken, I know you don't enjoy it either. But because I desire to serve you and to be with you, what comes from your hand, Lord, I take willingly, and I accept it, because I know you're my Heavenly Father and you want the best for me. And I, as your under-shepherd, want the best for you and your relationship with Him. I'm not your intermediary. You relate directly to God, but I do have a church that I need to keep in order. So the lesson here brings a culmination of last week and this week to put an exclamation mark on saying we need to get on and let this not be something that just we move on from as an instance and in a moment in time and, a few weeks down the road we forget about all this and it's just, something and you just move on, versus something that leaves an impact on your spirit where you say, I have to do some soul searching, but I know the Lord is with me. And if there's something that needs to be changed, broken, or fixed, God will do it. And the breaking will lead to a blessing because I know His hand is upon me like His hand is upon this church. So I will just say this to you. If you came in here thinking all hope is lost, I will say like Paul, fear not. No, an angel has not stood by my side this day. God's Spirit is with us, not just here, but when you go. So leave here with courage and with faith. Get up, point in the right direction with the right attitude, and let's get on to marching and following as we should. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.